a year ago, essentially March 2023, China had essentially signed more than 200 cooperation agreements with Belt and Road countries, with over 151 Belt and Road countries and over 32 international organizations. And the scale of the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, is very important for everyone to recognize. Because if you're looking at trade between China and countries of the Belt and Road Initiative in the past decade, that is from 2013 to 2023, that's essentially increased from 1 trillion to 2 trillion US dollars. And I think this slide clearly shows the degree of impact China has had on Belt and Road countries in terms of international exchange. This is also important because by the end of 2022, Chinese enterprises had essentially invested close to $57 billion in economic and trade cooperation zones throughout the Belt and Road Initiative. During this time, China has essentially rivaled the World Bank also to a certain extent with regard to overseas development finance, because from 2008 to 2021, the World Bank essentially lent close to 600 billion US dollars in overseas development finance. The World Bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. China, during the same period, has lent close to 500 billion dollars alone. China as one nation alone. If you're looking at overseas outward foreign direct investments, China for 2022 essentially stood at 3 trillion US dollars of foreign direct investment, particularly for infrastructure programs throughout the world. And if you're looking at, say, 2001 to 2022, that's an increase from 35 billion, right? $35 billion to close to $3 trillion. So this is a massive investment and exchange initiative that was sparked through the Belt and Road Initiative. But this doesn't all mean that China has behaved in a very peaceful manner. If you're looking at how China has shaped its economic statecraft, I think it's very important to recognize that China has used this in a somewhat aggressive way. As far back as 2010, when a Japanese Coast Guard vessel knocked against a Chinese fishing boat, China essentially stopped or restricted rare earth exports to Japan. And this was important because, like is on the slide, Japan depended on China for nearly 90% of its rare earth exports. 2 years later, when there was a flare-up over the contested waters of the Scarborough Shoal of the South China Sea between Philippines and China, China stopped imposed fruit import restrictions on the Philippines. Similarly, by 2017, when South Korea wanted to establish the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Missile System, the THAAD, in its own territory to prevent it from being attacked by North Korea, China essentially boycotted Korean products, even placed sanctions on the Korean Lotte Group. We see similar situations also with regard to a statement made by the Australian Prime Minister in a radio channel in Sydney, where he essentially argued that we need to have a thorough investigation of how COVID-19 came about as a pandemic. And as a consequence of his questioning of China's interpretation of the COVID-19 pandemic, Australia essentially had export restrictions placed on a number of products, including wine and other grains. All of this tells us an important picture when you look at China's economic statecraft. It is also more and more willing to exercise its economy in a coercive way. And I think this is very important for all of us to acknowledge, particularly in relation to the Sri Lanka-China relationship. Now, I want to look at the Sri Lanka-China relationship briefly in this one slide before we move forward. Because when you're looking at the Sri Lanka-China relationship, one of the very often heard statements is that China has been very peaceful in its overseas engagement, particularly with countries in South Asia like Sri Lanka. But if you actually look at historical records, particularly with regard to Cheng Ho or Zheng He in the Ming Dynasty, you can see that he came to Sri Lanka, he erected that Tribhasha inscription in Chinese, Tamil, and Persian in Gaul. But he also had serious political influence on developments in Sri Lanka, to the point where in 1411, he abducted the Sri Lankan king Alaga Konara because Alaga Konara disrespected Cheng Ho, took him all the way to China. And it was only after Alaga Konara, the Sri Lankan king, apologized to the Chinese emperor that he was let go. And even then, Alagakona wasn't able to be the leader, king of Sri Lanka, because the Chinese had already realized that Parakramabahu VII, who was later inaugurated as a king, is a more respectful leader to the Chinese. And this is just one incident in historical context where China engaged in this sort of aggressive behavior. We also saw it with regard to the 1962 conflict between India and China over the border, and also quite recently in 1979, when Vietnam invaded Cambodia against the Pol Pot regime. And China responded essentially by sending close to 200,000 troops, 14 divisions, into northern Vietnam. That was a military engagement. So China, while it has been essentially relatively peaceful compared with other great powers during the Cold War, has also engaged aggressively. And more importantly, in recent years, since the end of the Cold War, it has engaged more and more aggressively using its economy as an important tool of statecraft. And I think this is particularly important given the way in which China's military has also been increasing in recent years. And I think this slide gives you somewhat of an indication of the threat that some of the great powers face, because we talk about the Quad and the AUKUS and these sort of military alliances or initiatives that's been brought forward in recent years. But when you're looking at particularly expenditure on military, and I've taken the major four economies of Asia here, you can clearly see the government expenditure of China in terms of military activities is far above all of the other states. And this, many scholars of theory like realists, for example, neo-realists in particular, like John Mearsheimer, argue that it's a natural progression. When a country expands its economic footprint, it naturally increases its military capability, which then makes it somewhat aggressive in protecting its national interest. And we see this also in our own region, particularly with regard to the South China Sea that borders several Southeast Asian nations. Now, this is a map here displayed of the South China Sea, along with two images, which I'll talk about quite briefly. But essentially, the red dotted line that you see here, reflective of China's 9-line claims, which it argues this is part of its territorial waters. Why is this important? Because according to the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, we have clearly demarcated the extent of territorial exclusive economic zones and other types of demarcations with regard to territorial waters and so on. And the South China Sea is host to a lot of natural resources, but also fish. And when these Southeast Asian nations try to engage in fishing activity, it's very difficult for them to do so because of two reasons. One, China claims 80% of the South China Sea through the 9-line, right, which is depicted here in red. Also, whenever fishing boats from other countries come into these waters to fish, in their legally mandated exclusive economic zone, according to the UNCLOS, they are dealt with quite harshly. We saw this in recent months with regard to how Chinese Coast Guard vessels treat Philippine fishing vessels. And these are two images of Chinese Coast Guard vessels attacking, firing water jets at Chinese fishing vessels that enter into what China claims is its part of its territory. All of this is also important because you see other hotspots that are quite important for political developments in our region. A notable case in point is Taiwan. Just to reiterate, the situation in Taiwan is very volatile, particularly with regard to the recent elections, and China and the United States has not talked about Taiwan sufficiently. The IISS conference that is happening right now in Singapore is an opportunity for these two defense ministers to talk, which is a positive development. But Taiwan is a very sensitive topic. China considers Taiwan part of its own internal territory. Sri Lanka also agrees to the One China policy, which essentially argues that Taiwan belongs to mainland China. But the United States has given its support to Taiwan in terms of military equipment over a series of 4 decades, essentially. More importantly, Taiwan is also strategically important because a lot of semiconductors and close to 80% of the semiconductor market is in Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. So what happens in Taiwan has serious geopolitical implications on the entire global economy, on the supply chains of semiconductors and many other devices that we use. So Taiwan is a serious hotspot, and in recent years, Chinese speeches that have been quite aggressive with regard to a reunification of Taiwan into and bringing it into the fold of mainland China has increased, particularly with regard to Xi Jinping declaring that by 2049 he wants to actualize this. So, what China will do, especially as Europe is increasingly divided and economically relatively weak, as well as the United States is also focusing a lot of attention elsewhere, and we might even see a Donald Trump presidency. We don't quite know whether China will make a move on Taiwan in the next couple of years. And if it does behave aggressively or militarily to reincorporate Taiwan, we don't know how Asian geopolitics might evolve. And this is an area of dispute between China and Japan. Japan essentially controls the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, or Diaoyu according to the Chinese, Senkaku according to the Japanese. These islands are contested territory because of the oil and gas fields that are around it, which is depicted here in purple. And this is also quite a significant conflict or area or hotspot of potential conflict, because essentially Japanese fighter jets have to scramble against airspace violations by Chinese military aircrafts almost twice a day in recent years. And finally, with regard to the China-Indian border, which is very important given Sri Lanka's location, we've seen recent clashes over territory in Doklam with regard to Bhutan, which is, I think, depicted over here, as well as with regard to the Galwan Valley clash in June 2020. All of this is important because essentially China claims Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai chain, depicted here in yellow. And these contested territories, which has one of the most longest borders between two nations, is a potential source of conflict over either Bhutanese territory or between India and China. In recent years, we have seen, in recent months in particular, we have seen China starting to build road network systems and establish military installments in Bhutanese territory. And we don't know how India might react to these developments. If India reacts aggressively like it did with regard to the Doklam standoff, we don't know if tensions might spire into another conflict. So this is another sort of very important situation. Why is all of this important for Sri Lanka? I mean, these are regional conflicts, but why is it important? It's important for a number of reasons. Firstly, we've got to recognize that India and China are among our largest trading partners. They are leading in terms of foreign investors. We have a huge amount of Indian tourists coming in as well. And with regard to China, China has supported us in the United Nations Human Rights Council. China has also supported us with regard to financing many of our infrastructure programs soon after the end of the war in 2009. Similarly, India, particularly in recent months when Sri Lanka defaulted, has offered us currency swaps, lines of credit, which helped us import essential food, fuel, medicine, and other essential items, has been quite helpful, as well as China, as well as India was the first country to assure the IMF that it would help restructure Sri Lanka's debt. So Sri Lanka needs to manage relations between India and China very carefully. And how it does so has serious implications on not just regional geopolitics, but on the ability of Sri Lanka to manage different aspects, including its ability to acquire foreign direct investments, as well as manage its debt. And debt in particular has been a recent hot topic because, as you can see here, Sri Lanka's debt to GDP ratio has been very high and continues to be high. It's very difficult to sustain this, particularly because in terms of foreign exchange, we're only recovering right now with regard to tourism, and we get a sizable portion of foreign exchange from remittances, but it's just not enough, particularly with regard to managing our reserves. So what should Sri Lanka do with regard to this tense geopolitical situation? My argument is, and this is an argument I've made previously, I've just essentially reiterated it. I've seen in recent months, particularly under this administration, that a lot of scholars and newspaper writers, journalists have talked about the need to let go of non-alignment, saying that non-alignment is useless, that adhering to principles is pointless. We need to only focus on our national interest. Now, this was based on discussions that happened at LKI, discussions that happened at News First, and so on. All of this is important, I think, because we should recognize that non-alignment as a foreign policy and adopting a national interest-based approach should not be two different things. We can be principled in our position, and that principal position, for example, with regard to adhering to the UN Charter, with regard to adhering to other United Nations conventions, that principal position where we say violations of certain UN principles and violations of certain conventions is against our national interest, we can then see that a principal non-alignment based position is not in contravention to our national interest. It is in fact our national interest to adopt a principled, non-aligned position. A few months before the elections, we saw that Kachatu had reached a very important or became a hot topic. And a lot of local observers were talking about the legality of Kachatu, were talking about how we need to respond to India and what sort of diplomatic responses we should articulate. I think what the Sri Lankan government did with regard to Kachatu was smart because they didn't respond politically. They didn't bring the issue up to the highest level. And this is because the government understood that this is an election topic. This is an opportunity that is used by the BJP essentially to garner more votes. And because of this, they didn't let the Kachati issue, following Modi's Twitter and Dr. Subramaniam Jayashankar's statement, they didn't make that issue a political issue. And I think that was very important and that's quite smart. What happens in the elections in India, I think, is quite important for Sri Lanka. We need to watch and see how the development might happen in the coming days and weeks. But I think essentially Sri Lanka's relationship with India will remain on a steady footing, assuming that the next Sri Lankan government, whoever it is, recognizes the importance of adhering to what is in our national interest as well as being sensitive to India's security concerns. And this is something that's very important to reiterate. Being sensitive to another regional country's security concerns doesn't mean that we are always going to abide by whatever policy they tell us. No. But as a small state who relies so much on India's support, I think it is important for Sri Lanka to recognize that it does not adopt measures that might damage or hurt ties with India or China. We also need to be very aware that great powers like India, like China, as they expand economically, will increase their military presence in the region. And in doing so, they might engage in clashes over different regional hotspots like the ones I mentioned. So it is important for Sri Lanka to design a policy with strategic foresight so that whatever development happens, either in Taiwan, either in the Indo-China border, that Sri Lanka adopts a policy that is not only in line with its national interest, but also does not lead Sri Lanka to choose between one or the other, because we cannot choose. And this is something that Southeast Asian nations have been saying for a long time, that they will not choose between either great powers. Similarly, we should state very clearly that we do not want to choose between either countries. Both are imperative for us. And we need to balance our relationship so that their tensions and hostilities, or their bilateral challenges, or their bilateral tensions, doesn't damage our bilateral relations with either India or China. I think that's quite important.